Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. Mike Goucher with you, and we are today releasing the second round of results of the latest Marquette University Law School National Survey of Public Attitudes toward the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining us again today is the poll's director, Charles Franklin. And Charles, yesterday we were talking about the political importance of Supreme Court appointments. Today we're going to talk about the legitimacy of the court. But before we do that, let's talk again a bit about when we were in the field and the number of people we talked with.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, this is the second annual survey of public attitudes towards the court that Marquette Law School is doing. We are focusing on a number of topics, and this time, today, we're going to zoom in and focus on questions of legitimacy and confidence in the court. We interviewed September 8th through 15th. So we completed the interviews a few days before Justice Ginsburg's death. We interviewed 1,523 adults nationwide. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.3 percentage points. And once in a while, we talk about likely voters, and that sample size is 1,357 likely voters, a margin of error for that of plus or minus 3.6 percentage points.
So, Charles, let's begin with I guess one of the biggest questions. Do people generally approve of the way the court is handling its job?
They do, and fairly strikingly so. 66% say they approve of the way the court's handling its job. 33% disapprove. That is strikingly high when you look and compare it to approval of how Donald Trump is handling his job or approval of Congress. The court scores really quite high marks. Not very many people or institutions reach above 60% approval, and the court at 66 is kind of remarkably high.
And compare that, if you would, to our other institutions, the presidency or Congress, for instance.
Well, in terms of institutions, we also asked, which institution do you trust the most of the three branches of the federal government? 59% said that the court was the one they had the most trust in. 24% said the presidency, and just 16% said Congress. Congress never fares very well in these kinds of comparisons. But again, you see 66% approval, 59% this is the most trusted branch. The court stands out quite well in that.
So one of the things that was interesting in this poll, Charles, is that given the fact that nominations to the U.S. Supreme Court have become very bitter partisan affairs, it seems, we found that both Republicans and Democrats say they think the court is handling its job well.
Pretty much. Now, you know, you're talking about an overall 66% approval, so approval's likely to be high everywhere. And there are some party differences. 80% of Republicans approve, 64% of independents, and 57% of Democrats. But even among Democrats, that's still a pretty solid majority, though the partisan gap is fairly large between Republicans and Democrats on those questions.
What about for people, and we give them the opportunity to describe themselves ideologically, how do they feel about the way the court is handling its job?
Again, across 5 different self-classifications, from very conservative, moderate, liberal, very liberal. 4 of those 5 have more than 60% approving of the court. The only exception is the group of very liberal respondents, and they are 45% approve, 55% do not. That's the one ideological group where the court is in negative territory. But I think it is kind of striking that 64% of people who call themselves liberals do approve, as do 63% of moderates. Approval slightly higher with conservatives at 79 and 67 among those who are very conservative.
Among those who approve of how the court is doing its job, Charles, who are they likely to be voting for in this presidential election?
Well, among those who approve of the court, it's an even split. This is among likely voters, 46% for Biden, 46% for Trump. It's among those who disapprove of the court that we see a real party split or a vote split. Of those who disapprove, 62% are supporting Biden, 24% Trump, and a few more, the rest of that group, are voting for a third party or saying they're not sure how they'll vote. If we look at all likely voters, 50% support Biden and 40% support Trump. So you can see that the disapprovers are considerably more pro-Biden. Those who approve, being evenly split, are what I just said, evenly split instead of the overall tilt towards Biden.
You mentioned that we did look at likely voters as part of this sample. Any difference really between likely voters and those who are less likely to vote in terms of their approval of how the court is doing?
Only a little bit, but 69% of likely voters approve, 30% disapprove. So very small 3-point increase. But it is striking that if you think of likely voters as more involved in politics, that approval of the court there is just a little above average, not by any means below average.
Charles, one of the things we did ask about is whether or not people, despite the fact that they seem to feel fairly good about the court, are they receptive to changes in the way the court does its business? And let's begin with whether or not the court has the power, which it does, to review laws by Congress. Is there any group of folks out there who don't agree with that idea?
Yeah, there is. This is an area broadly where social scientists and the legal community have talked about the legitimacy of the court, that whether it's approval or confidence in the court, it's that the authority of the court, which doesn't have an army to send to enforce its rulings and doesn't control budgets, but has to persuade the public and other institutions to accept its rulings, that those authorities, those powers rest on the legitimacy, the perception that the institution of the Supreme Court is making rulings that have legitimacy and a presumption that they should be obeyed. But there is this second element of legitimacy, and that is no matter whether you approve or disapprove, how willing are you to change the institutional arrangements or the powers of the court? And so that's what we're trying to get at with this set of questions. One of the hallmarks of the Supreme Court's power goes all the way back to 1803 in a famous case, Marbury versus Madison, which established the right of the court to review laws and strike them down if they found them to be unconstitutional. So we asked an information question: does the court have this power to review laws passed by Congress? And 87% said yes, it does. But not a trivial percent, 13% said no, the court doesn't have the right to review the laws that Congress passes. So that's our first bite at this, of whether that authority, it's been around for more than 2 centuries, is universally known. It is very widely appreciated that it does have that power, but with more than 10% who think it doesn't.
Let's take a second bite. Does the president have to obey the rulings of the court? What do people say about that?
Again, 82% say that the president must obey a ruling of the court that goes against them. But now 16% say the president has the power to ignore rulings by the court. So we're still under 20% there, but we are beginning to reach a level in which a sizable, well, I shouldn't say sizable, a minority that's approaching 1 in 5 are suggesting that the president is not bound by rulings of the Supreme Court.
And
that would be a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the court.
Sure, and we'll continue to see some of these numbers tick up a little bit as we present other options to people. Would the voters favor limiting the ability of the court to review acts of Congress?
Right. And here the difference is our first question was more of a factual question. Does the court have this power? Now we're asking, would you favor limiting the ability of the court to review acts of Congress? Now 41% support that idea that we might limit judicial review. 58% oppose that change. But as I said, this is a power that goes back 200 years. That is a substantial minority now at 41% that would favor making those kinds of changes.
What about term limits for justices, Charles?
Well, here we go all the way back to the Constitution, which specifies that federal judges serve for good behavior, or basically lifetime appointments. But a whopping 75% of our respondents would favor term limits for justices. We didn't say how long, but favor a fixed term. Only 25% would oppose that change. This is something that would require amending the Constitution to implement, but it is striking how large the majority is that is no longer supportive of those lifetime appointments for judges, federal judges.
And the other thing that you hear an awful lot about these days is expanding the court, packing the court, whatever you want to call it. This is really very much a part of our political conversation today. How did people feel about the prospect of expanding the size of the court?
I think this is an interesting question, and it's very much wrapped up in the politics of the court and now in the appointment of a replacement for Justice Ginsburg. I just wanted to give a touch of background that the size of the court has been changed over time, but maybe when it's changed is also instructive because the last set of changes was in the aftermath of the Civil War at a time when the country was very divided politically, and changing the size of the court was part of those political debates. Then in the late 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt proposed his so-called court packing plan, which ultimately did not go forward, but again was sparked because the president was unhappy with a set of rulings by the court that went against his New Deal policies. So when this issue comes up in American history, it has consistently been related to some deep political divide in the country. And now we're talking about this, and we are again deeply divided. On this question, 46% favor an increase in the number of justices. We didn't say how many. 53% oppose that change, so a pretty even balance. And as you would expect, there's a substantial party difference in support for expanding the size. 65% of Republicans oppose an expansion. 61% of Democrats favor it.
So from a partisan standpoint, Charles, on a couple of the changes you've talked about, not much difference, but on the packing issue, the expansion of the court, there we see clear differences.
Exactly. In terms of limiting the terms of service, and also on judicial review, there's much less difference among party groups. I think part of this, in fact, probably all of it, is that we really haven't had a partisan debate on how long terms are. We haven't really had a partisan debate on limiting judicial review. Not to say we couldn't have one, but we haven't had one yet. But right now, the argument about expanding the court is very partisan. And so what you see in the numbers I mentioned, almost 2/3 of Republicans opposed, 61% of Democrats in favor, is an example of how the partisan side of this issue does affect willingness to change the structure of the court. But on areas that are profound, like term limits, there's not much of a partisan debate, and there's not much partisan difference on those.
Charles, what about changing the balance of powers, giving the president more authority to make laws where Congress fails to act?
Yeah, this isn't directly about the court, but it does go to the support for the institutions that we have and how those are specified by the Constitution. So the question we asked was, if Congress fails to act, should the president have the authority to make laws on their own without Congress passing the law? And here we found 1 in 4, 28% saying the president should have the power to make laws completely on their own. 72% said the president should not have this authority over the legislative branch. But this is an important area because it does go straight to the basic structure of the Constitution, with a legislative branch that legislates and the executive branch that executes the laws but doesn't make them. And so here again, we're seeing that maybe the devotion to the institutions and the structure of the Constitution aren't quite as strong as they might be.
Are the views of Democrats and Republicans different or similar on this?
Well, here we do see a partisan difference. Republicans are evenly divided. 50% would give the power to the president to make laws on his own. 50% would not. But among Democrats, only 18% favor giving the president that power, 82% opposed. And independents are about the same as Democrats, 20% in favor, 80% opposed. Now, certainly this probably has resonances of who is the president, and that parties are deeply divided about that president. But if I could push back on the broader picture, we have seen presidents gain autonomous authority over decades. This is not a short-term change. And executive orders is a good example of that, something that has been used at least since World War II and actually before that. But we've seen a growing reliance on executive orders in the Obama administration when the Republican Congress wouldn't pass legislation that the president favored. President Obama used executive orders for some of that. And now in the Trump administration, President Trump has relied heavily on executive orders to skip going through Congress. So I think this is actually a very real question, and it's not at root partisan because it goes to the growth in authority of presidents to act unilaterally. And it also reflects the difficulty of passing legislation through Congress, a problem that we've seen grow over the last 20 or 30 years as political divisions have made what we thought of as sort of normal legislating in earlier decades much harder to accomplish, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House.
So, Charles, the bottom line here is what? It's that the court fares better than our other institutions, but yet people are still willing to look at some of these potential ideas and changes.
I think that's a good summary, that the high level of approval and confidence in the court stands out. That is the reservoir of good feelings about the court that allows people to obey court decisions, even if they disagree with those decisions, and leads them to look on the court in a favorable way, again, despite the intense political battles we see over nominations and issues that come before the court. But it would be a mistake to assume that because we have confidence and approve of the court, that it is immune from pressure for institutional change. And those changes can be in the size of the court or its jurisdiction and judicial review, its powers. And I think in the broader context here, as we just talked about with presidential powers, support for the detailed institutional arrangements of the Constitution are not, in fact, universally agreed upon, and they do vary in the short term and the long term with political debates and political divisions in our country. And to that extent, the legitimacy of the court maybe is not as solid, doesn't rest on as strong a foundation as that 66% approval rating might lead you to believe at first glance.
Charles, we'll be releasing our final group of results tomorrow. What will we be looking at then?
Tomorrow, we'll turn to the question of decisions of the court. How do people think justices do decide cases? How do they think they should decide cases? And then we'll turn to some recent decisions or issues that are likely to come before the court and see how the public feels about those recent or potential future decisions.
And for those who want to take a closer look at the data, where do they go?
They go to law.marquette.edu/poll, P-O-L-L, and that will show you in reverse chronological order the releases for all of our court and previous polling for Wisconsin. At the top of that page, you'll see a little tab for results and data. And if you click on that, you'll go to all the details of the releases. They'll show you all the questionnaire, the methodology statement, the results for every question, the crosstabs. Also, because this time we're releasing our Supreme Court poll in 3 separate releases, actually 4, we did one over the weekend as well. You will see partial results with each day's release, but on Friday we will post absolutely everything in one convenient location so you can see the entire survey and the full context of the questions, as well as the exact question wording.
Charles, thanks very much for walking us through the results, and thanks to everyone watching today. We'll see you back here 12:15 Central Time tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.